Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bruce Nix, Director of Business Agility for Vaco, coming to you with another very interesting topic on the City Current channel. Today, I'd like to welcome Craig Cockburn, all the way from the UK. Craig and I connected on LinkedIn, and we had a couple of conversations on red teaming, which is an interesting concept. And so I'd like to introduce Craig Cockburn. Craig, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. And why don't you give our audience a little bit introduction on kind of who you are and really how did you get into red teaming?
Hi, Bruce, and thanks for having me. Yeah, as you said,
Absolutely.
I'm based in Edinburgh, actually in Scotland, and it's good to be speaking to your audience over there in the States. So a bit of background about myself. I was originally a software engineer and then got into test management and then project management, program management, and then a lot of Agile work, Agile Scrum Master and coaching. So kind of a largely technical and project management career, and then more actually Agile. And as part of being an Agile coach, I go to lots of meetups and conferences and learn. And I came across sort of red teaming fairly recently. Interestingly, though, when I look at red teaming, it actually goes back a really long way as a practice. And when I look back at my own career, I see certain similarities with how I used to work myself as a test manager, and some practices that I used to use almost 20 years ago, which are quite compatible with red team thinking and red teaming. So it's a thing that's been around for quite a while. The terminology might be unfamiliar to some people because it's been perhaps a bit specialized in military contexts, but it's starting to gain a lot of traction now in broader Agile spheres because its benefits are now being recognized. Especially when, I mean, it's all very well with Agile to say we're Agile, we can flex and we can adapt, but sometimes you genuinely do need to get things right at the first attempt. Otherwise, there's a big cost. You lose like prime mover advantage and you have to dig yourself out of a hole. And as we've seen kind of, from recent history of companies going bust, they followed the wrong strategy for too long and didn't think kind of broadly enough. And, these things have been happening recently and will happen again in the future. So red teaming, I think, is becoming more relevant in the world of Agile, because it's not just about being able to adapt to things that changed. It's trying to foresee how things will be in the future so that preferably you get it right at the first attempt, and getting it wrong has a really high cost.
Okay. So can you tell us a little bit more really about, I guess you kind of, you touched on a little bit, but what really is red team thinking? And you mentioned it came from the military. Did it come from a specific branch of the military and kind of where it originated and then it spread across the other branches?
Well, the term red team thinking has a particular origin, but actually red teaming as a practice goes back even further than that. You may have heard the term devil's advocate. This actually originated in the 16th century, so quite surprising for an Agile practice to be going back as far back as that. But the practice, it was Pope Sixtus V, which is quite a tongue twister in itself. But in the 16th century, what was going on is that I think this was just post Reformation, and there was the Protestant Church and the Catholic Church. But certainly within the Catholic Church, there was a desire from local communities to have their own saint, because in doing so, you got lots of money. The Vatican recognized that this became an even growing problem, and getting somebody appointed to be a saint was costing them money, and it was a problem that they needed to solve. So the process for getting a saint was deemed to be a bit too easy. So they set up an office called the Office of the Devil's Advocate, which I think existed right up until about the 1980s. And the purpose of the Devil's Advocate Office, which is a real thing in the Vatican, was to oppose, by constructively opposing the arguments for sainthood and saying the reasons why somebody should be a saint. And by trying to highlight the weaknesses in the argument, it then had the desired effect of reducing the number of saints that were then approved. And not only that, but presumably saved the Vatican a lot of money, is that when people realized that their applications are going to be challenged, there was actually fewer applications. So it wasn't like they generated more work for themselves by challenging every application. People then self-managed themselves by saying, this probably won't go through, we won't even bother sticking the application in. So it had the desired effect of reducing the number of applications and reducing the amount of work for the Vatican and probably saving them money too. So that's where they sort of see the origin of these sorts of principles. And that was, say, the late 1500s. Now, the actual term red teaming came about, I think this is now the early 1900s in the sort of Napoleonic era. And this is where we get into the military aspects of things, because the Prussians, now, I don't know if it'd been America if you know your European history, but the Prussians kind of were occupied a land that's kind of like northern Germany and Poland now. And the Prussians were fighting the Napoleonic army. And the Napoleonic army fought in red, and the Prussians fought in blue. And in order to improve their battle tactics, the Prussians decided to start simulating being the opposition, start wargaming really. So they would have a pseudo team in blue, and they would then have some Prussian experts in battle strategy forming a team and pretending that they were the Napoleonic side. So they'd be setting up a red team to pretend that they were the enemy. And through saying, well, if you were in this situation, what would you do? They would then run through battle scenarios in advance to get a better insight of what could happen on the field of battle, to then prepare themselves better from a strategic point of view, and then develop battle strategy thinking better, so that when the battle was actually fought, they were more well prepared. So this is where the kind of origins of red teaming originated from, in the colours of the armies at the time. And we see also things like wargaming in the same sort of genre.
Right.
So that's kind of the origin. And it has been, I think, adopted by the US military to improve their thinking. So I think the key turning point here was the 9/11 moment, where there was, I suppose, a lack of connected thinking to say, right, you know, there was, when you look back after 9/11 and go, you know, were there any signs that were missed? And there were, but it's just that people weren't thinking kind of out the box enough to really understand the bigger picture. They were just taking things rather at face value. Apparently in the run up to 9/11, there was a lot of pilots wanting training to be pilots, but not wanting practice at landing. And I guess that must have been a warning sign, but it wasn't really missed. It wasn't really, it was missed and not really picked up. And you go, but if somebody had just taken a contrarian point of view to say, but why would somebody want to be a pilot but not want to land? What could that mean? But rather than trying to think, you know, out the box, it was just, oh yeah, you want pilot's lessons, off you go, with training up. So this is, I think, the moment at which red teaming started to become much more mainstream in the US military, and is then sort of spread out from there. And I think it's used in the UK as well, and is now starting to become better known in management in general.
Okay. So, well, I mean, why does red team thinking really matter for an organization? It sounds like, I mean, there were a few things to think more strategically and perhaps even get them out of this complacent thinking, which could perhaps just, you know, so that they're not even aware of some of the potentials that could be out there. But why does red team thinking really matter to an organization? Why should it matter?
Well, you know, to give you a couple of examples now, you mentioned as well that I'll be doing this talk on strategy later on. And interestingly, in that talk, I mentioned a couple of significant failures. Mm-hmm. And when we look back at those failures, it's actually the examples that I quote, of which Blockbuster is one. The reason I picked those kind of failures wasn't that the industry went away. You know, Blockbuster got displaced by Netflix. It's not like renting films went away. It's simply that effectively a lot of companies shot themselves in the foot by not taking the competition seriously enough, mm-hmm. and just assuming they would just keep on making money. And in fact, it wasn't that the industry went away, is that the competition put them out of business. And so what we found that with the Blockbuster Netflix scenario was that I think that it was back in about 2008 when Blockbuster was quite successful, making lots of money off of late fees. The chief executive at the time said basically that Netflix wasn't even on the radar in terms of competition. Yet less than 2 years later, they'd filed for bankruptcy. And the reason they filed for bankruptcy is they'd been displaced by the competition because the competition was their biggest problem, but they didn't recognize that at the time. Now, if they'd red teamed their strategy, they would have then maybe discovered what the weaknesses were in their strategy in order to then go, well, actually, rather than just carrying on doing much the same year in, year out, and nothing changes and make loads of money, we need to understand where our key weaknesses are and where the weaknesses might originate from and where disruptors might come from to then anticipate their movements and be ready for that rather than just carry on as before. I mean, it was much the same with Kodak, right? So Kodak made loads of money off of processing film, and certainly the camera business has not gone away in any shape or form. In fact, people take more pictures than ever before. But Kodak was so wedded to the idea of making money off of films that even after they invented digital cameras even, and were sitting on the future, they chose to ignore it. But it was that future that was about to put them out of business. So you've just got to accept that things change, and sticking to the old ways for too long, you know, it's sending you down a cul-de-sac and you don't realize you're in that cul-de-sac and until it's too late. You've always got to be on the lookout. And this is where red teaming really complements Agile, because Agile works really well in terms of higher level plans and flexible plans and being adaptive when things change. But if you're not aware of where your biggest risks are and changing your strategy in relation to that, then it may be too late and your competition has taken the market away from you and it's too late to do anything about it.
Yeah, that was a fascinating story about Kodak, because I read that story where they actually they invented the digital camera in the 70s, but management said that's great, but you know that can directly compete with our film.
You see a bit of this in business, traditional business thinking, which is protect the core business, which is all very well, but your core business in the future might not be your core business in the past. It's funny because I also use the example of Nokia, who between them and BlackBerry completely dominated mobile phones about 20 years ago. And they were both massive companies, and they're hardly on the radar now because really what happened is that they got displaced by Apple and Google because things moved to platforms and apps, and Nokia didn't really take that seriously enough. And Nokia actually started off as a fish processing plant and a sawmill, and pivoted and changed so many times over their history that eventually they got into electronics, and eventually then they got into mobile phones. It's quite funny in a time of COVID to look back at Nokia's history and see how many times they changed. And interestingly, Nokia actually made respirators for 60 years, which might have been quite a useful business line to have been in now. But they pivoted into mobile phones, but didn't really realize that mobile phones would become a platform-based commodity. And the winners in that platform war were the ones with the best apps and the most apps. Therefore, it was the platform that was then compelling people to buy the phone. Whereas Nokia had a strategy which was about great cameras, oh, and by the way, there's some apps. And you know, the camera's important, but it wasn't important enough. So they didn't really recognize where things were ultimately going to go.
Yeah, no, that's very good. So as we go through this, what are some key practices that some of our listeners can take back to even their teams and organizations? What are some practices that support this red team thinking?
Well, I think the thing that the red team really does is it gets away from what we call groupthink, which is everybody just saying yes because it's easy and everybody agreeing with one another. I mean, this is the sort of things that led to some of the catastrophic banking collapses about 10 years ago, where everybody just said yes because saying no was a career limiting move. And it was easy to just say yes because that's what the chief executive wanted you to say. So really, there's some good practices that kind of encourage this diversity of thinking and diversity of speaking up. Now, I'll also speak about diversity in boards and getting more women and coloured people and disabled people into boards, and that's all good. But we all shouldn't forget it's actually diversity of thinking that's also really important too, because just having a board that all thinks the same, well, they're all just come up with the same answer. So a good sort of facilitative practice, this is where it's come into use as me as an Agile coach, is to facilitate and to encourage diversity of speaking. So rather than the boss goes first and then everybody else knows what the boss wants, they all then agree, you could have practices like the boss speaks last, or everybody writes things anonymously, so that if there's no psychological safety there, then there's no penalty for them for speaking up. So you get practices of anonymous feedback and then sharing that anonymously to kind of encourage diversity of views. And also people not sharing ideas. So if everybody writes something down without collaborating with one another, then you get the full diversity of the room. But if people are allowed to collaborate, then you would end up with fewer ideas. So by all means, write things down and discuss them, but write them down first. So therefore, we'll capture the diversity of ideas rather than a few people dominating the conversation and you've only got 2 or 3. If, as a coach, you've used liberating structures, there's quite a few in the liberating structures portfolio that supports red team thinking. So one is, for instance, nobody speaks twice until everybody speaks once. So that way you're not having a few people dominating the room, and you've got everybody to speak with their ideas until then someone else can come back, and that stops people dominating the conversation. But in collaboration with that, it's better to have written down the idea or shared it anonymously to get that diversity captured at the outset. Another practice, Gary Klein has been quite a key figure in this movement, is what's called the pre-mortem. So a post-mortem is when something's gone wrong or somebody's died, and you look at the causes to say, okay, so why did they die, or why did that thing go badly? A pre-mortem is envisaging a future in which things have gone badly, but they've not yet happened. So then you say, well, if things have gone bad in this future state, what are the preceding steps that would then cause that future state to arise? And then you work backwards in that future state, maybe 4 or 5 steps, do maybe like 5 whys, say, well, if that occurred, why would that have occurred? Why would that have occurred? So you arrive back at the present. So you see that future roadmap mapped out to a future failure state that has failed. And then you go, right, of that future roadmap, where are we now? And sometimes with Agile teams, we have like a press release model where you write your positive press release, everything's gone really well. That's really good for talking about what you're doing and getting the team motivated and together. And that future press release is the positive journey, and the pre-mortem is the negative journey. And at some point they're going to diverge. So visualizing where they diverge and where you are can then help understand the things you need to watch out for, how you're going to measure whether you're on the right track or not, and where you need to pivot. Because if you pivot early, then it's probably going to be a more advantageous situation than if you pivot too late. So the pre-mortem tactic is being deliberately opposite in order to then be very aware of the bad outcomes that could arise and what the enabling steps are that make that happen.
Very good. Yeah, I really like the point you made about the cognitive diversity. I was actually having a conversation with someone the other day about that a lot of organizations, often to me, I'm labeling it a mistake. That could be a little too negative, but they go forward with the thinking that, well, we want to bring on people that think like us. And that is sometimes actually the very opposite of what you're looking for. To your point, you need equal diversity in how people think in order to bring and generate new ideas if you're going to compete in the marketplace of the future.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to diss MBAs, but an MBA has value. But if everybody's been to a similar type of school, come from a similar type of background, and been able to afford a similar type of college, you've already reduced the cognitive and economic and cultural diversity already before you've even got there. So yeah, by all means have MBAs in your room if it helps you, but don't just have MBAs in your room, and have that diversity of social and economic and cultural experience as well.
Yeah, very good. So what are some key things for people that are thinking about red team thinking, red teaming? What are some key things to remember to really make it work in their environment?
Yeah, well, I've touched on earlier some of the practices that you can use, but I think it's important to recognize that there's a bit of a cultural shift here. So, you know, you could set up a red team itself that is an explicitly different team with permission to challenge. But red team thinking is about, well, if you can't set up a separate team, use the red team practices. But it's important to recognize that, like any practice, it's useful in a particular context. So it's like you wouldn't necessarily apply Agile to everything because it's not always suitable, and doing experiments in Agile has a cost. But you do them in Agile because you need those experiments in order to derive knowledge. So same with red team thinking, it's a tool that's appropriate in context. You shouldn't just red team everything because that has a cost. So you would look at things where there's a particularly high cost of getting it wrong. This is obviously why it's particularly useful in battle strategy, because if you've invaded another country, well, you can't just sort of say sorry and pull out again. So think about the relevant context where it's useful, and give the red team permission to be to carry out that mission without penalty to them. So when you are offering constructive dissent, it's important to just not be a pain in the ass. You know, it's important to be constructive. It's important to be professional, and not just be obnoxious, and not just challenge everything, because, you know, then nothing would get done. So it's about that appropriate balance and being constructive and professional about it. Now, when I think back to my career as a test manager, I, you know, had people, you know, working for me who just followed test plans, and that was fine, and that's fair enough. But I'd be taking the contrarian point of view to say, well, I kind of know that's passed those tests because they've done their job, but about thinking, what would be the consequence if this went wrong? You know, what would be the impact, and where might we be really wanting to look out for those risks? Because if this website gets, you know, a bad reputation, it's out there in the press, with them and fewer customers. So that's an instance in which the impact is quite significant in terms of reputational damage. So you want to employ it in things where, you know, it's appropriate to be constructive and to dissent against conventional thinking where the cost is very high. But it's appropriate to be professional about it, to say, in this type of instance where the reputational damage is very high and undoing the damage is very difficult, that's the sort of instance where it's particularly useful. Now, if you go away and you do these techniques and practices and you learn stuff because you're a red team, and red team thinking's come up with alternative scenarios, or discovered something you didn't already know, or discovered what perhaps your opponents in industry might be thinking of doing, it's only going to work if you act on that advice. If you just say, well, thanks for the knowledge, was going to carry on, then obviously that's not really going to add any true value. So you need to be bought into the idea of the people doing red teaming may come up with something quite difficult that challenges, you know, your thinking so far, but you've really got to embrace that and act on it, because they're there for your benefit in the right context. So back in the days of when I was a test manager, you know, sometimes test managers get a bit of a bad rap of just saying, you know, we're just there to point out the mistakes that the programmers make, and they go, well, not really. I'm there to actually save the reputation of the company. So I'm here with positive intention because I want the company to have a good reputation in the marketplace. So I'm catching the bugs before the customer sees them. And so I'm saving the company from a problem. And that's about the positive message. And red teaming is much in that same sort of vein. It should be considered a positive thing that prevents a problem later on, rather than just being negative and critical.
Okay, very good. Well, Craig, we're coming up to the end of our time. Unfortunately, I feel like we could probably carry on this conversation, definitely a deeper dive. But for those people that are interested in learning more, what would be some good references for the audience to look into as far as some reading or workshops that you may be doing, anything like that?
Yeah, well, there's a few workshops coming up, and there's a book that was just published earlier this year by Bryce Hoffman, who wrote the book about Ford, and it became a bestseller. So this is his next project. So if you go to redteamthinking.com, there's a lot of useful information there about the book and some associated practices, as well as some courses coming up. So it's kind of, this started off in the US, but it very quickly spread to the UK. And based on the interest that's arisen, it does look like it's going to go much further in the coming years, particularly at a time of COVID, because people are now having to consider the impact of things that change quickly.
Right.
So it's quite relevant just now.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you very much. And we will post some additional links when we publish the video out for everyone to look into. And Craig will also be speaking at our Memphis Agile meetup in August, and we'll share the link on that as well. Craig, thank you so much for taking some time out today. We definitely appreciate your insight on this topic, and we look forward to learning more about it. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. It's been nice to speak to you.
Mm-hmm.